It's good to be back. This is not the time or the place, and I'm not the best person to share any stories from our trip. There's others in this room who could probably have better stories than me. Just know it was a tiring, full adventure. We did stay at a church, and one of the requests of the host church was that we go to one of their church services. And so doing that, it was a good thing for me because I have a newfound appreciation for what it's like to sit through a long sermon. And I have an appreciation for your position when a preacher takes you hostage. So I'm resolved to not do that to you. It's good for me every year or so to just remember what that feels like. So, but lots of other great stories from the trip we'll share when the time is right. What I wanted to do today, one was celebrate Independence Day, use our readings and our prayers, because the Episcopal Church, probably more than any other church, has this unique relationship with the founding of our country, because both came from England, both came out of rebellion from England, and both were kind of drawn up and formed by the same people, right? George Washington was Episcopalian, right? He was Anglican, then he became Episcopalian. But a lot of our founding fathers of this nation were part of this church. Some of the founding bishops of the Episcopal Church were there when the Declaration of Independence was signed, right? There's a lot of overlap in the Episcopal Church and the founding of this country. So Independence Day has always had a special connection with the Episcopal Church. What I wanted to do today, that was the first thing, is just remind us all of that. And the second was talk about a few ways for us that might be helpful as we think about how we as Christians live in our nation. I think for a long time, there was just an assumption that certain nations were Christian nations, and you didn't really have to think about how you lived in them, because what the nation did was Christian things, and that was good. And that was probably true during a time, but I don't feel that time is now. Right? There's a lot of Christians through history that have just lived in nations that weren't necessarily Christians, but they were Christians that lived in a nation. Right? The New Testament Christians were an example of that. There's been lots, and there's certainly in our time Christians around the world, right? Christians in India don't necessarily live in a Christian nation, and certain Christians around the world share the same. European Christians share the same type of reality we share. They are Christians that live in a secular nation. So how do we as Christians navigate that? You know, how do we do that with a heart that can both love our God and love our country, but understanding that sometimes just the flow, the current of things in our nation isn't necessarily what would be pleasing to God. So here's three that I think Scripture points us in the direction of. And the first is we live in our nation with prayerfully. There's a story in the Old Testament 600 years before Jesus. It's the exile into Babylon. Babylon conquers Jerusalem, burns it down to the ground, destroys the walls, destroys the temple, destroys the downtown, the king's palace, all of it, burns it to the ground, and carries out all the smart people, all the educated people, the professionals, and leads them into Babylon. And that's where they're going to live. They're not going to live in their land anymore. They're going to live in Babylon. That's what the Babylonians decided. And the people of Israel are asking questions. They're praying like, God, how do we live here? This isn't our place anymore. It's not familiar. It's not comfortable. How do we live here? Should we try to take it down from the inside? Should we try to be insurgents? Should we try to start problems? Should we work against it? And God speaks through the prophet Jeremiah. He says, tell them this. Pray for the city you're in. Right? Its peace is your peace. Its prosperity is your prosperity. Pray for the city you're in, even if it feels unfamiliar. Because guess what? The conflicts in your city are going to be conflicts that your children are going to be drawn into. The war in your city is going to be warfare that your children and grandchildren are going to be drawn into. But its prosperity is going to be prosperity that affects your children and grandchildren. Its peace is going to be a peace that your children and grandchildren can share in. So they said, pray for your city that you're in. even if sometimes it feels unfamiliar. And I hear that from a lot of people that grew up in a country that looks a little different than it does now. They say, gosh, I don't recognize this, some things about our country anymore. It might feel unfamiliar, but the Lord's word would be the same. Pray for it. Pray for its peace and its prosperity, right? If it fails, we fail with it, right? When the Great Depression happened, it wasn't as if the Great Depression hit people who didn't believe in God and not people who did, right? Everyone suffered with it, right? When World War II happened upon a generation of Americans, it wasn't as if some people felt the effects of it and others were completely free of it, right? It was something that all of us at that time, that generation, had to face together, right? The struggles of a nation are carried by all of us, and the peace of it benefits all of us. So Jeremiah, the Lord would tell Jeremiah, pray for your nation. Maybe something we could do this week is turn some of our anger or some of our frustration with our country into prayer. We believe prayer is productive, right? That's part of our faith. We believe prayer is a productive place to put that. So maybe whatever it is, whatever might frustrate us, and the Lord knows there's enough things to put on that list. But whatever it is, maybe we could turn our frustration into prayer instead of just being angry. So the first one is to live with prayer. The peace of our city, the peace of our nation is the peace for our children and grandchildren, right? Its conflicts will be theirs too. So prayer. And the second one I would say is with gratitude. That's not often something we go to first, but with gratitude. And when I was in Wyoming, we had a companion diocese, a sister relationship with the diocese in Tanzania, of all places. You know, you think, oh, Wyoming and Tanzania, just like that. But Tanzania. And so their clergy would always come, their bishop and a few of their clergy would come to Wyoming as our guests. And then they would always invite all of the Wyoming clergy over to Tanzania for a big conference. But it was always in Tanzania. And, you know, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of church meetings, but going to Tanzania for a church meeting doesn't sound fun either. It doesn't sound like a fun way to be in Tanzania. And so one time at our diocesan council, I got a chance to have dinner with one of the bishops, and I said, why don't you ever bring your clergy here? Why can't we do it here? And he said, John, if my clergy saw how God has blessed Americans, they would never want to come home. He's like, I don't think I could get them to come back. He's like, you don't even realize that if I went home and told them, yeah, everybody has a car, they would say, no, can't be true. You know, everybody has access to these things. They would say, no, that can't be true. And if they came here and saw it, they would say, how can we stay here and not go home? So he never wanted to bring his clergy here because he was afraid a lot of them wouldn't want to come back, right? The things we woke up with today, most of the world prays for. It's just a hard thing to wrap our heads around because we're usually kind of focused on maybe what we don't have or how things could be better or how we get more. But the things we all woke up with today, most of the world prays for. Right? 93% of the world lives under $12,000 a year. Doesn't have access to the things you have. 93%, 7.9 billion people in the world, 93% of them would trade spots with you sight unseen tomorrow, or me, just because of what we woke up with today. And someone asked me this morning at the early service, they said, are you sure, knowing what's going on in our politics, they still would? I said, yeah. Because, you know, they don't even care. You know what it's based on? You have clean water. 25% of the world doesn't. You have a steady food source. There's a great portion of the world that doesn't. Right? You have shelter from heat and from wind and from rain and from sun. Right? You have access to health care. You have emergency rooms. You can get antibiotics. Right? Those are the things they care about. They don't care about if our politicians fight. They care about the fact that their kids could get medicine when they're sick. Right? We have access to safety services that they don't. Right? We take for granted in the U.S., if we call 911, we believe someone's going to show up quickly. There are so many places in the world where there is nothing like that. And then, not to mention, even in other places where some of those things exist, the freedom that we have to speak, the freedom that we have of expression and speech that many countries don't have. 93% of the world would trade with us tomorrow, sight unseen. So all that's wrong, no one is saying America is perfect. But this week, maybe prayer and a little bit of gratitude for the blessings we wake up with that we take for granted every day, that billions of people, literally billions of human beings, pray for every morning, that they could get medicine for their kids, that we could just easily go to the store and get, right? Those types of things. So gratitude. It's why people will always want to be here, right? They don't care about who fights in Washington. They always want to be here because their opportunities for their families are better here. There's 93% of the world would trade with us. So gratitude for the blessings that we have, and gratitude for the people who sacrifice their lives to preserve them. I think gratitude is a great way to walk this week as we interact with our nation, just to realize how blessed we are. And then the third one I would say is with perspective. This one might be a little challenging, but with perspective. So when Jesus was alive, all the people of Israel were kind of united in this thought. Here's our problem. It's the Romans. Our problem's the Romans. They unfairly govern us. They unfairly tax us. They oppress us. And they weren't wrong, right? The Romans charged exorbitant taxes. They weren't really gentle and kind in their governance. And they did look at the Jewish people as kind of second or third class. So they didn't give them the same rights as Romans would have got. That's all true. And they said, this is our biggest problem. And God, if you're listening, if you're going to do something, if you're real, if you're active, you're going to send someone to clean this problem up, because this is our biggest problem. And what God said is, I am going to send someone to clean up what I know your biggest problem is. It's here. It's the sin and the evil that can lodge and grow in our own hearts. That's what Jesus came to talk about. And a lot of people didn't listen to him because they were fixated on the Romans. They said, no, God, our biggest problem is the Romans. And Jesus was saying, no, my Father says your biggest problem is here. And they wouldn't listen, and they missed it. And so there are times, I think, when all of us could get swept in this wave where we think our biggest problems are Romans, right? Whatever our kind of political issues might be, or whatever our challenges might be, as real as they are, we might stop and think, this is the biggest problem. God, if you're there, why don't you do something about this? When God is saying, John, I've been trying to change your heart. That is your biggest problem. Stop missing it. And so there's a danger that, just like the Jewish people of Jesus' time that missed it because they couldn't stop thinking about the Romans, that we might think about our Romans so much we might miss what God's trying to do in our life. And that is a cause to give us perspective. Right? Whatever is going on in our nation, and we're heading into a presidential election year, and you know how things are going to get. All of that is very real. The divisiveness is real. The just nasty, cruel way we get with each other around these issues is real. But God may be saying, here's where I want to work. In your heart. In the transformation of who you are, that's where I want to put my energy. And so if we're so focused to say, God, do something about who's running for president, or God, do something with this, we may miss it. So I'm asking you not to miss it. Because there were a lot of people who missed Jesus because they couldn't stop thinking about the Romans. And I don't want us to be so consumed in the next year with our Romans that we miss what Jesus is trying to do in our life. So my hope for this week is, one, we could maybe turn some of our anger and frustration to prayer. To pray for the peace and prosperity of our city, of our state, of our nation, because its peace is the peace for our children and our children's children, to maybe have a greater sense of gratitude for the things we woke up with today that are just normal, that are the prayers of so many in this world, that are afforded to us because of where we live, and to keep perspective of where Jesus wants to work in our hearts and in our lives amidst all the noise we're about to hear in the coming year, that we don't miss him, obsessed with our Romans. We still live in a place that is pretty amazing. Not perfect by any means, but pretty amazing. The thought of my great-grandfather coming over from Sicily, a poor Sicilian farmer, was that my son will be a poor Sicilian farmer, his son will be a poor Sicilian farmer, and his son will be a poor Sicilian farmer. That's our life. He came here just to say there's a chance something could be different. Never in his wildest dreams would he probably think one of his great-grandsons would be a priest, and not a Catholic one. That probably would have offended him quite a bit, but he would have came around eventually, right? Never would he think his great-grandchildren would be in med school and in law school and doing those types of things, right? There is a blessing here amidst all our problems. There are so many blessings to be grateful for. So I hope this week we can be in prayer, gratitude, and keep perspective of how God is working, even in the midst of the challenges that are real, that he's still very present and working in our lives. In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.